The leather strap dug into the palm of Jorah's hand as he pulled it tight, testing the resistance against the rough coat of his donkey. He was a man of precision, a man who believed that survival was merely the result of meticulous preparation. Every knot had to be secure. Every pouch had to be balanced. On the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho, a single loose buckle could mean the difference between arriving at the destination or vanishing into the silence of the canyon. Jorah checked the inventory in his mind for the third time. On the left flank of the animal hung the heavy wineskins, fermented and strong, intended for trade but capable of serving as an antiseptic if the need arose. On the right were the flasks of pressed olive oil, sealed with wax to prevent spoiling in the heat. Wrapped deep within the bundle of wool blankets was his money pouch, containing enough silver to purchase new stock in the markets of the lower city. He did not carry a weapon of war, for he was not a soldier, but he carried a sturdy staff of oak, polished by years of handling. He was a Samaritan. In this land, that single word was enough to paint a target on his back. He knew the whispers that followed his kind when they walked through the holy city above. He knew the looks of disdain, the way the shopkeepers would drop his change onto the counter rather than touching his hand. To them, he was an outsider, a distortion of their faith, someone to be avoided. Therefore, Jorah had learned the art of invisibility. He kept his head low. He moved with purpose. He never lingered. His schedule was fixed in his mind like stone. If he left now, while the sun was still climbing toward its zenith, he would reach the halfway point before the shadows grew long and dangerous. He had calculated the pace of his donkey, the weight of the cargo, and the steepness of the descent. There was no room for error. There was no margin for charity. Jorah mounted the path, his sandals crunching against the dry, loose gravel. The air was already beginning to thicken with the heat of the valley below. This was not merely a road. It was a descent into the belly of the earth. The route dropped sharp and fast, twisting through limestone corridors that seemed designed by nature to hide predators. They called it the Way of Blood, not because of the color of the rocks, but because of the violence that stained them. As he walked beside his beast, Jorah's eyes scanned the ridgelines constantly. He did not look at the majesty of the cliffs. He looked for movement, a shifting shadow, a falling pebble, the sudden silence of birds. His mind was a fortress, locked tight against distraction. He had errands to run, a deadline to meet, and a family waiting for his return. His compassion was reserved for his own kin, for those who sat at his table. The world outside his circle was hostile, and he owed it nothing but caution. He urged the donkey forward with a sharp click of his tongue. The animal hesitated at a narrow bend, its ears twitching. Jorah felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. He gripped his staff tighter, his knuckles turning white. He paused, listening to the wind howling through the gaps in the stone. It sounded like a morning cry. "Move," he whispered to the animal, his voice rough and low. "We do not stop. We never stop." He believed he was the master of his journey. He believed that if he simply followed the rules, kept to his schedule, and minded his own business, the road would let him pass. He did not know that the road had other plans. Your support brings light to the stories often left in the shadows. Hit like and subscribe to help us reveal the truths that others walk past. Stay with us, because on this dangerous road, help is coming from the last person you would ever expect. He did not know that a few miles ahead, his carefully constructed reality was about to shatter against the jagged edge of another man's tragedy. Jorah checked the sun again. He was on time. He was safe. He was wrong. Elian felt invincible. It was a dangerous arrogance, born of a successful transaction in the capital and the heavy weight of gold hidden beneath his tunic. He was a son of the covenant, a man of standing, and he walked the road to Jericho with the stride of someone who believed God was obligated to protect him. He had declined the offer to travel with the caravan that left at dawn. They moved too slowly, burdened by families and livestock. Elian wanted speed. He wanted to be home before the first star appeared. The heat pressed down on him, but he ignored it, his mind occupied with thoughts of the future. He planned to expand his vineyards, to build a new storehouse, to secure a marriage contract for his eldest daughter. The world was opening up to him, bright and full of promise. He adjusted the strap of his sandal, not stopping, barely breaking his rhythm. The attack did not begin with a shout. It began with a sudden, violent impact that stole the breath from his lungs. Before Elian could register the figure leaping from behind the rocky outcrop, a heavy club struck his shoulder, sending him spinning into the hard earth. The world tilted sideways. Dust filled his mouth. He tried to scramble to his feet, to shout a command, to assert his authority, but a boot slammed into his ribs, pinning him down. There were 3 of them, or perhaps 4. In the chaos and the ringing in his ears, Elian could not count. They were not men. They were a blur of violence, faceless and efficient. They did not speak. They only grunted with the exertion of their brutality. Hands grabbed at his tunic, tearing the fine linen. He felt the cold air against his skin as his outer garment was ripped away. "Take it all," one of them hissed, a voice like grinding stones. Elian tried to protect the hidden pouch at his waist, curling his body into a ball, but this only invited more fury. A kick landed squarely against his temple. White light exploded behind his eyelids, followed by a wave of nausea that left him paralyzed. He felt them cutting the pouch loose. He felt them pulling the rings from his fingers, dragging them over the knuckles with no regard for his flesh. The struggle lasted less than a minute. They stripped him of everything, his wealth, his clothing, his dignity. They left him with nothing but his broken body. As quickly as the storm had descended, it vanished. The sound of running footsteps faded into the vast emptiness of the canyon. Elian lay face down in the dirt, the taste of copper blood thick on his tongue. He tried to lift his head, but his neck refused to support the weight. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound he barely recognized as his own. He was alone. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the violence. The road, which had seemed so wide and accommodating an hour ago, now felt like a tomb. Elian realized with a jolt of horror that he was invisible. He was lying in the ditch, half hidden by the shadow of the rocks. To anyone passing by, he would look like a pile of discarded rags, or worse, a carcass left for the scavengers. Pain began to bloom across his body, radiating from his shoulder, his ribs, his head. It was a throbbing, rhythmic agony that synced with the slow beating of his heart. He tried to crawl, digging his fingers into the dry soil, dragging himself inches toward the center of the path where he might be seen. But his strength had bled out with the attack. His vision blurred, the edges of the world turning gray and fuzzy. He thought of his plans. The storehouse, the wedding, the schedule, all of it seemed to dissolve like smoke. He was no longer Elian the merchant, Elian the respected father, Elian the blessed. He was merely flesh and bone, broken and discarded. Through the haze of his fading consciousness, he heard footsteps. A rhythmic, steady approach. Hope flared in his chest, a desperate, burning ember. Someone was coming, a traveler, a brother. Surely they would see him. Surely they would stop. He tried to call out, but his throat was too dry, swollen from the trauma. Only a rasping wheeze emerged. He could only watch through slit eyes as a figure approached, dressed in the robes of a holy man. Elian's heart leaped. A priest, a man of God. If anyone would help, it would be a servant of the temple. But the footsteps did not slow. The shadow fell over him for a brief second, then moved away. The priest saw him. Elian knew he saw him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a moment, a look of recognition, followed by a look of calculation, and then retreat. The priest stepped to the far side of the road, gathering his robes tight to avoid contamination, and hurried past. The rejection hit Elian harder than the club. He was not worth stopping for. He was an inconvenience. He was unclean. The darkness began to close in around the edges of his vision again. He lay in the dust, the sun beating down on his exposed skin, waiting for the end. He did not know that another traveler was coming. He did not know that his story was not over, but that it was about to be rewritten by the hands of someone he would have never invited into his home. The priest walked with the rhythm of a man who believed his steps were ordained by heaven. He was coming down from Jerusalem, his service in the temple complete, his heart filled with the echoing chants of the Psalms and the scent of burning incense. He wore his tunic with precision, the fabric clean and white, a symbol of his separation from the common dust of the world. To him, the road to Jericho was merely a corridor between the holy city and his home, a necessary inconvenience that he navigated with his chin held high. He was not a cruel man. In the safety of the synagogue, he spoke often of mercy. He recited the laws that commanded care for the widow and the orphan. But out here, under the unforgiving sun, the law took on a different shape. It became a shield. It became a set of boundaries designed to keep him safe, pure, and apart from the chaos of ordinary life. When he first saw the shape lying in the middle of the path, his initial instinct was annoyance. It looked like a bundle of discarded rags, an obstacle that forced him to break his steady pace. But as he drew closer, the wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable metallic scent of fresh blood. The rags were not rags. They were the torn remnants of a tunic. The bundle was a man. The priest stopped. His sandaled feet froze inches from a dark stain on the dry earth. He leaned forward, squinting against the glare. He saw the bruising on the victim's back, the unnatural angle of the arm, the stillness that suggested death. A war erupted instantly in his mind. It was not a battle of emotion, but of theology. The law was clear. To touch a corpse was to become unclean. If he reached out, if he checked for a pulse and found none, he would be defiled. He would be stripped of his holy status for 7 days. He would have to undergo rituals of purification. He would be unable to eat the sacred tithes. Is he dead? The priest wondered. The man did not move. There was no rise and fall of the chest that he could see from this distance. If he is dead, I cannot help him, the priest reasoned. And if I touch him to find out, I taint myself for nothing. The duties of God require me to remain pure. Fear began to creep in alongside his legalism. This was the work of bandits. Violence had happened here only moments ago. What if the attackers were watching from the ridges, waiting for a second victim to stop and mourn the first? The priest clutched his robes tighter against his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with compassion, but with self-preservation. He looked at the broken man one last time. He saw the vulnerability, the nakedness, the absolute need, but then he looked at his own clean hands. The choice was made. It was a cold, calculated decision wrapped in religious justification. He convinced himself that this was fate, that God had already called this man home, and it was not his place to interfere with the cycle of life and death. The priest stepped sideways. He moved to the far edge of the road, pressing himself against the cliff face as if the very air around the fallen man was contagious. He walked quickly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look down. He did not run, for running would admit panic. He walked with a stiff, rigid dignity, leaving the man behind in the silence. As the distance between them grew, the priest began to recite a prayer under his breath, drowning out the quiet accusation of his own conscience. Time passed, measuring its length in the slow movement of shadows across the canyon floor. The man in the dirt remained motionless, a statue of suffering. Then, the sound of sandals returned to the road. This traveler was a Levite. He was a man of practical service, one who assisted in the temple duties, handled the scrolls, and maintained the order of the sanctuary. He was less concerned with high theology than the priest, and more concerned with the realities of the world. He walked with a hurried, nervous gait, his eyes darting from the road to the rocks above. He knew the reputation of this place. He knew that the silence of the Jericho road was often a liar. He saw the body long before he reached it. It was impossible to miss. The Levite slowed his pace, his curiosity warring with his caution. Unlike the priest, he did not immediately recoil. He was a man who needed to know the truth of a situation. He approached slowly, stepping into the center of the road where the violence had taken place. He stood over Elian. He saw the shallow, ragged breath that shuddered through the victim's frame. The man was alive. For a heartbeat, the Levite felt a pull in his chest. A human impulse to kneel, to offer water, to cover the exposed skin. He took a half step forward, his hand reaching for the water skin at his belt. But then, his eyes caught the disturbed earth around the body. He saw the drag marks. He saw the violence of the struggle. His imagination, sharp and terrified, began to spin a story. This is a trap, the thought whispered in his mind. This is how they catch you. They leave one alive to moan, to cry out, to lure the sympathetic traveler into the kill zone. The Levite spun around, scanning the cliffs. Was that a movement behind the scrub brush? Was that the glint of a knife in the shadow of a boulder? The canyon felt suddenly crowded with invisible eyes. The silence felt heavy. pregnant with a threat that was about to unleash itself upon him. He looked back down at Elian. The man's eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused. A hand twitched, reaching out blindly toward the Levite's shadow. Help! The victim's lips formed the shape of the word, though no sound came out. The Levite took a step back. Panic seized him by the throat. If he stopped to help, he would have to put down his pack. He would be vulnerable. He would be stationary. And what could he do? He had no medicine. He had no donkey to carry a wounded man. He would only be burdening himself with a dying stranger, making himself an easy target for the thieves who were surely watching. The priest passed by, the Levite realized, seeing the footprints that skirted the edge of the road. If the holy man did not stop, why should I? Who am I to be braver than my superior? It was a convenient excuse, a shield to hide his cowardice. He convinced himself that the man was beyond saving, that the kindest thing to do was to let nature take its course, rather than prolonging the inevitable. He convinced himself that his own wife and children needed him to return home alive, more than this stranger needed him to stop. I cannot, the Levite whispered to the empty air, as if apologizing to God or to the victim. I cannot. He turned away. But unlike the priest who had walked with dignity, the Levite moved with the frantic energy of fear. He crossed to the other side of the road, practically hugging the stone wall, his feet moving faster and faster until he was nearly running. He did not look back. He wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and the dying man. He wanted to forget the look in those eyes. He wanted to escape the road that demanded a courage he did not possess. Behind him, the dust settled. Elian let his hand fall back to the earth. The last of his hope vanished with the retreating footsteps. He closed his eyes against the sun, accepting the darkness that was rising to meet him. 2 of his own people had seen him. 2 had passed him by. There was no one left to come. Jorah guided his donkey around a sharp bend in the road, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The sun had shifted, casting long, jagged shadows across the trail, creating illusions of movement where there was none. He was making good time. If he maintained this pace, he would clear the most dangerous section of the descent within the hour. His mind was occupied with the mental arithmetic of his business. The cost of the oil, the potential profit from the wine, the taxes he would owe at the gate. Then, the donkey stopped. The animal planted its hooves firmly in the gravel, its ears laid back flat against its head. Jorah clicked his tongue, urging it forward, but the beast refused to move, letting out a low, nervous snort. Jorah tightened his grip on the staff, his instincts instantly sharpening into a blade of suspicion. He looked past the donkey's head and saw it. There was a disruption in the dust, a stillness that felt heavy. Jorah saw the body lying near the edge of the ditch. From this distance, it was merely a heap of flesh and torn fabric, unmoving, silent. Jorah's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew immediately what this was. It was the aftermath of a raid. The signs were written in the scattered stones and the drag marks that scarred the earth. His first impulse was not compassion, it was survival. His muscles tensed, ready to turn the donkey around and flee back up the slope. He scanned the ridgeline, his eyes narrowing. If the man was down there, the predators were likely close, watching, waiting for a second fool to walk into their trap. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to keep moving, to kick the donkey into a run and pass the carnage before it claimed him too. But he did not run. He urged the donkey forward, slowly, cautiously, until he was parallel with the fallen man. Jorah looked down. He saw the features of the victim. Even through the swelling and the dirt, the lineage was clear. The cut of the beard, the remnants of the prayer shawl that lay shredded nearby. This was a Jew. This was a man from the tribe that despised Jorah's people. This was a man who, if he were standing, would likely cross the street to avoid Jorah's shadow, or perhaps spit on the ground at his feet. A bitter irony twisted in Jorah's gut. Why should I stop, he thought. If the tables were turned, he would leave me to the vultures. He is not my brother. He is not my neighbor. He is a stranger, an enemy, a complication I do not need. He looked at the tracks in the dust. He saw the distinct imprint of sandals that had walked by, one set on the far side, hurried and deep, another set closer, but retreating fast. Others had seen this man. His own people had seen him and chosen safety. Why should Jorah, the outsider, be the one to risk his life? He gripped the reins, preparing to look away. He had a family. He had a schedule. He had a life that depended on him arriving in Jericho alive. But then, the man in the ditch moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible twitch of a hand, a desperate clawing at the empty air, and a sound followed, a low, broken gasp that sounded less like a plea for help and more like a surrender to death. That sound pierced through Jorah's logic. It bypassed his prejudice and struck something deep within the center of his chest. It was an interruption he had not asked for, a burden he did not want, but suddenly it was a weight he could not refuse. The walls of his self-preservation crumbled. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he could not ride on. To leave this man to die would be to kill something inside himself. Jorah cursed under his breath, not at the man, but at the situation. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The dust puffed up around his sandals. He was no longer a traveler passing through. He had stepped into the arena of suffering. He tied the donkey's lead to a scrub bush, took a deep breath of the hot, dry air, and walked toward the enemy who needed him. The distance from the donkey to the ditch was only a few paces, but it felt like crossing a chasm between two worlds. As Jorah knelt in the dirt, the smell hit him, the copper tang of blood, the sour scent of fear, and the dryness of the earth. Up close, the damage was horrific. The man's tunic had been stripped away, leaving his skin exposed to the relentless sun. Deep lacerations crossed his shoulders where the club had struck. His face was swollen, his lips cracked and parched. He looked less like a human being and more like a broken vessel, discarded and shattered. Jorah reached out. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear of the bandits now, but from the gravity of what he was doing. He touched the man's neck, seeking the pulse. It was there, faint, thready, racing like a trapped bird. "Can you hear me?" Jorah asked, his voice rough. He spoke in the common tongue, stripping away the accents that divided them. The man's eyelids fluttered, but they did not open. He was drifting in the dark waters of shock. Jorah knew he had to work fast. He reached for the pouch at his belt and pulled out a small knife. He turned to his own supplies on the donkey. He did not have medical bandages. He did not have the tools of a physician. He had only what he carried for trade. He took the wineskin and the flask of oil. He returned to the man and uncorked the wine. "This will burn," Jorah whispered, though he knew the man could not understand. He poured the crimson liquid over the open wounds. It washed away the grit and the dried blood, cleansing the cuts. The man's body jerked violently, a reflex of agony even in his unconscious state. Jorah placed a firm hand on the man's chest, holding him down, murmuring soft words of comfort that had no meaning other than their tone. The wine was precious, a commodity meant to be sold for profit, but Jorah poured it out until the wounds ran clean. Next came the oil. Jorah poured the thick, golden liquid into his own palm and began to rub it gently into the battered skin. The oil soothed the sting of the wine, sealing the edges of the cuts and softening the bruises. It was an intimate act. Jorah's hands, rough and calloused from labor, moved over the skin of his enemy with a tenderness that surprised him. He was touching the unclean. He was covering himself in the blood of a stranger. By the laws of the priests, he was making himself filthy. But in the quiet of the canyon, it felt like the holiest thing he had ever done. "I need to bind this," Jorah muttered to himself. He looked around. There was nothing. The robbers had taken the man's cloak. Jorah looked down at his own clothes. He wore a sturdy linen tunic, woven by his wife, meant to last him through the winter. Without hesitation, he took his knife and sliced into the hem of his own garment. The sound of ripping fabric was loud in the silence. Jorah tore long strips from his tunic, destroying his own property to save a man he did not know. He lifted the man's heavy, limp limbs, wrapping the linen tightly around the wounds, binding the brokenness together. His hands became slick with oil and blood, staining his clothes, staining his skin. He worked with a singular focus, ignoring the sweat that stung his eyes, ignoring the danger of the open road, for these few minutes. There was no Jew and no Samaritan. There was only a body that was broken and a set of hands trying to put it back together. When the last knot was tied, Jorah sat back on his heels, breathing hard. He wiped his hands on the dust of the road. The man was still unconscious, but his breathing had steadied. The bleeding had slowed. Jorah looked at the sun. It was lower now. The danger was increasing with every minute they lingered. He looked at the donkey, then at the heavy, unconscious weight of the man in the dirt. The easy part was over. Now, he had to move him. And Jorah knew, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that the hardest part of this interruption was just beginning. He had saved the man from dying, but now he had to save him from the road. The sun was beginning its final descent, casting the canyon floor in a deceptive, golden light. Jorah stood over the man, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirty hand. The binding was done. The bleeding had stopped. But now came the task that would break him. The man was dead weight, unconscious and limp. He was heavier than a sack of grain or a cask of wine. Jorah looked at his donkey. The animal was skittish, smelling the copper scent of blood on Jorah's hands and on the stranger. It danced sideways, its hooves clattering against the loose stones, eyes wide with instinctual fear. "Steady," Jorah commanded, his voice low and firm. He grabbed the halter and pulled the beast closer to the ditch. He bent down, sliding his arms under the stranger's shoulders and knees. With a grunt of exertion that echoed off the canyon walls, Jorah heaved. The strain tore at the muscles in his lower back. His knees trembled under the sudden, immense load. The stranger was a tall man, well-fed and broad-shouldered, a man built for comfort, not for being carried. Jorah staggered toward the donkey. The animal shied away again. "Hold still," Jorah shouted, losing his patience. He drove his shoulder into the donkey's flank, pinning it against a large boulder to keep it steady. With one final, agonizing push, he hoisted the stranger's body up. The man flopped over the saddle like a discarded garment, his head hanging down on one side, his feet on the other. Jorah quickly grabbed the ropes he used for his merchandise and lashed the man's torso to the animal's back. It was not dignified, but it was necessary. If the man slipped off on the steep decline, the fall would finish what the bandits had started. Jorah checked the bindings. They were tight. He looked at the donkey. It groaned under the new weight, its legs bracing against the gravity of the slope. Then, Jorah looked at the path ahead. He realized with a sinking heart what this meant for him. There was no room for him to ride. The donkey could not carry two men, not on this terrain, not in this heat. Jorah would have to walk. He took the lead rope in his hand. His feet, clad in sandals meant for riding, were already aching. He was tired. He was thirsty. And now, he had to navigate the treacherous miles to the nearest outpost on foot, guiding a frightened animal and a dying enemy. "Walk," Jorah ordered. The procession began. It was slow and torturous. Every step Jorah took sent a shock of pain through his calves. He had to keep his eyes on the ground to avoid twisting an ankle on the rocks, but he also had to keep his eyes on the cliffs to watch for the return of the thieves. He was vulnerable, exposed, and moving at a crawl. The schedule he had worshipped that morning was now a distant memory, replaced by the rhythmic, grinding reality of sacrifice. He was no longer a merchant. He was a beast of burden. Twilight in the valley of Jericho was not a time of peace. It was a time of hunting. The light did not fade gently. It was swallowed by the high walls of the gorge, plunging the road into premature darkness while the sky above remained a taunting violet. Jorah walked with one hand on the donkey's neck and the other gripping his staff. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of hooves and the heavy, ragged breathing of the man on the saddle. Fear began to set in. It was a cold, creeping sensation that started at the base of his spine. Jorah knew this road. He knew that this was the hour when the predators, both animal and human, emerged from their dens. He felt eyes on him. Every rustle of the dry scrub brush sounded like a footstep. Every shift of the wind sounded like a whisper. The stranger began to stir. The movement was small at first, a twitching of the fingers, but soon it grew into a delirium. The man let out a low moan, his head thrashing against the coarse hair of the donkey. "Quiet," Jorah hissed, glancing up at the darkened ridges. "You must be quiet." The man did not hear him. The fever was rising, fueled by the trauma and the infection that surely lurked in his wounds. He began to mumble, words spilling out in a disjointed stream. Jorah listened, his stomach tightening. The man was speaking Hebrew, reciting prayers, calling out names of people. Jorah did not know, perhaps a wife, perhaps a child. "Water," the man croaked, the word distinct and desperate. Jorah stopped. He looked at the water skin hanging from the saddle. He had enough for himself to reach the inn, perhaps a little more. If he gave it to the stranger, he would be drinking dust for the rest of the journey. He hesitated. The logic of survival told him to save the water, but the logic of the road, the new logic he had accepted when he stopped, demanded something else. He uncorked the skin. He did not drink. Instead, he lifted the man's head gently, tilting the flask against the cracked lips. The water spilled over the man's beard, washing away the dried blood. The stranger gulped greedily, coughing as the liquid hit his throat. "Enough," Jorah said, pulling the skin away. "We have miles to go." He capped the flask and urged the donkey forward again. The act of giving the water had cost them precious minutes. The darkness was now complete. Jorah had to rely on the faint light of the stars and his own memory of the path. He stumbled over a root, nearly falling to his knees. A curse escaped his lips. Why was he doing this? The question burned in his mind. He could have left him. No one would have known. He could be safe in Jericho by now, sitting by a fire, eating a warm meal. Instead, he was out here in the void, risking his neck for a man who, in his delirium, was praying to a god he believed despised Samaritans. But Jorah kept walking. He put one foot in front of the other, not because he felt a warm glow of charity, but because he was too stubborn to quit. He had taken this burden, and he would carry it to the end, even if it meant dragging himself through the dark. The lights of the inn appeared like a cluster of stars fallen to earth. It was a low, sprawling structure built of rough-hewn stone, pushed up against the side of the cliff for protection. It was not a place of luxury. It was a fortress for the weary, a caravanserai where travelers huddled together for safety against the night. Jorah approached the heavy wooden gates. He was exhausted. His tunic was soaked with sweat and stained with the stranger's blood. His legs felt like lead. He pounded on the wood with the end of his staff. "Open," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the dust. "I have a wounded man." A slat in the gate slid open. Eyes peered out, suspicious and hard. "Who are you?" a voice demanded. "A traveler," Jorah said. "Open the gate." The heavy bar was lifted, and the gates groaned inward. Jorah led the donkey into the courtyard. The space was crowded with animals, camels, donkeys, and sheep, and the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, dung, and roasting meat. Men sat in clusters around small fires, their voices low, their eyes turning to watch the newcomer. When the light of the torches hit Jorah, the courtyard went silent. They saw his Samaritan clothing. Then they looked at the man on the donkey, a Jew, beaten and half naked. The tension in the air was immediate and sharp. In this land, such a pairing was unnatural. Was this a servant, a prisoner, a victim of the Samaritan himself? The innkeeper pushed through the crowd. He was a large man with arms the size of tree trunks and a face that had seen every kind of trouble the road could offer. He looked at Jorah, then at the man on the donkey. He saw the bandages. He saw the care that had been taken. "What happened?" the innkeeper asked, stepping closer but keeping his hands free, ready for trouble. "Bandits," Jorah said, untying the ropes that held the stranger. "I found him on the upper pass. He needs a bed. He needs water and heat." The innkeeper hesitated. He looked at the Samaritan. He knew the hatred that existed between these people. He saw the exhaustion in Jorah's face, the trembling in his hands. This was not the look of a criminal. It was the look of a man who had walked through fire. "Bring him in," the innkeeper said, gesturing to a servant. "Take the animal to the stable. Feed it well." Together, Jorah and the innkeeper lifted the stranger from the saddle. The man groaned as his weight shifted, his legs dragging in the dust. They carried him through the courtyard, past the staring eyes of the other travelers. Jorah ignored them. He did not care about their judgments or their confusion. He only cared about getting the weight off his shoulders. They entered a small room off the main hall. It was simple: a straw pallet on the floor, a stone basin, and a single oil lamp. But to Jorah, it looked like a palace. They laid the man down on the straw. Jorah sank down against the wall, his legs finally giving out. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the innkeeper bark orders for warm water and clean linens. They were safe. The road had not won. "You have money?" the innkeeper asked, his voice practical, cutting through the moment. Jorah opened his eyes. He reached into his tunic and pulled out his pouch. He did not haggle. He did not ask for the price. He knew that sanctuary was expensive, and mercy even more so. But as he looked at the man breathing softly on the pallet, Jorah knew he would pay whatever was asked. This was no longer just a stranger. This was an investment of his soul. The room was small, suffocating, and smelled of sickness. Jorah sat on a wooden stool that wobbled on the uneven floor, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. The rest of the inn had fallen into a heavy, snoring silence. But for Jorah, sleep was an enemy he could not afford to entertain. On the straw pallet, the stranger was fighting a war. The fever had arrived with the darkness, violent and consuming. Elian's body was burning, radiating a heat that seemed to suck the moisture from the air. He tossed and turned, his limbs thrashing against the linen sheets Jorah had purchased from the innkeeper. Every movement threatened to tear open the wounds Jorah had so carefully stitched and bound on the road. "Peace," Jorah whispered, leaning forward to press a wet cloth against the man's forehead. Elian cried out, a guttural sound of panic. His eyes flew open, but they were blind to the room. He did not see the stone walls or the flickering oil lamp. He saw the bandits. He saw the club coming down. He saw the faces of the men who had left him to die. He lashed out, his hand striking Jorah's wrist with surprising strength. Jorah did not recoil. He caught the man's wrist and held it firm, pinning it gently to the floor. "You are safe," Jorah said, his voice a low rumble. "The thieves are gone. You are in the inn." It was a battle of wills. The stranger fought the ghosts in his mind, and Jorah fought the exhaustion in his bones. For hours, it went on like this. Jorah would wet the cloth in the basin, wring it out, and apply it to the man's neck and face. He would hold a cup of water to the cracked lips, coaxing the man to swallow, drop by drop. In the quiet moments between the bouts of delirium, Jorah looked at the man's face. He traced the lines of worry on the stranger's brow, the gray in his beard. He wondered who was waiting for this man. Was there a wife pacing the floor in Jerusalem? Were there sons wondering why their father had not returned? A strange sensation took hold of Jorah. On the road, this man had been a burden, a heavy object to be moved. But here, in the intimacy of the sick room, he was becoming a person. Jorah realized that he was memorizing the face of his enemy. He was learning the rhythm of his breath. The barriers of their ancestry, the walls of Samaria and Judea, were dissolving in the sweat and the struggle of the night. Around the middle watch of the night, Elian began to shiver violently. His teeth chattered, a hollow, rattling sound. The fever had broken, giving way to a bone-deep chill. Jorah stood up, his knees popping with the effort. He took his own outer cloak, the one he used for sleeping, and spread it over the stranger. It was a heavy wool garment, smelling of travel and Jorah's own life. He tucked it around Elian's shoulders, covering the man completely. Now Jorah had nothing. He sat back down on the stool, hugging his arms to his chest for warmth. He watched the rise and fall of the stranger's chest under the borrowed cloak. "I am a fool," Jorah thought, rubbing his tired eyes. "I am cold, tired, and delayed. I have spent my oil, my wine, and my strength on a man who might wake up and curse me." But as he watched Elian's breathing deepen into a true, restful sleep, the thought lost its sting. There was a quiet victory in the room. Death had come knocking at the door, demanding this man's life, and Jorah had barred the way. He had stood in the gap. He did not sleep. He kept his eyes on the lamp, trimming the wick when it burned low, ensuring the light did not go out. He was the guardian. He was the brother born for adversity. And as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the wooden shutters, Jorah knew that the night had changed him just as much as it had saved the man on the floor. Morning brought the sounds of the courtyard to life, the braying of animals, the shouting of traders, the clatter of pots. Jorah stood up and stretched, his back screaming in protest. He felt grit in his eyes and a deep, hollow hunger in his stomach. He looked down at Elian. The man was still asleep, but the color had returned to his face. The gray pallor of death was gone, replaced by the pale look of exhaustion. He would live, but he would not walk today, nor tomorrow. Jorah gathered his things. He rolled up his empty wineskin and placed the stopper in his depleted oil flask. He checked his money pouch. It was lighter than it should have been, but he still had enough for his business if he was careful. He could not stay. His own family, his own obligations, were waiting. The delay of one day was manageable. A delay of a week, would be ruinous. He had done his part. He had rescued. He had healed. He had watched. Now he had to trust. Jorah walked out into the main hall. The innkeeper was behind a rough wooden table, counting copper coins from a pile. He looked up as Jorah approached. The big man's eyes were shrewd, assessing the Samaritan with a new kind of respect. "He lives," Jorah said simply. "I heard the wrestling in the night," the innkeeper grunted. "I thought you would lose him." "He is strong," Jorah replied, "but he is weak. He cannot travel. If he is put on a donkey today, his wounds will open, and he will bleed out before he reaches the city gates." The innkeeper stopped counting. He leaned back, crossing his massive arms. "And you are leaving." It was a statement, not a question. The innkeeper knew the way of the road. Men moved on. "I must," Jorah said. "My business waits for no man." "And what of him?" The innkeeper jerked his head toward the room where Elian lay. "Who pays for his bed? Who pays for his food? Who washes his bandages? I run an inn, Samaritan, not a charity house." Jorah reached into his tunic. He felt the weight of the silver in his hand. He pulled out 2 denarii. These were not small copper mites. These were silver coins, heavy and valuable. Each one represented a full day's wage for a laborer, enough to buy food and lodging for many days. He placed the 2 coins on the table. The silver clicked loudly against the wood. "Take care of him," Jorah said, his voice steady. "This pays for his room. This pays for his broth. This pays for your time to check on him and ensure his wounds do not fester." The innkeeper looked at the silver, then up at Jorah. He was surprised. Most men would have dumped the body and fled. To pay 2 denarii for a stranger was unheard of. "This is a lot of silver for a dead man walking," the innkeeper muttered, though his hand reached out to cover the coins. "He is not a dead man," Jorah said sharply. "He is my charge." Jorah leaned over the table, locking eyes with the innkeeper. He needed to be sure. He needed to know that this transaction was binding. "Listen to me," Jorah said. 2 denarii is the beginning. If he needs more food, give it to him. If he needs better wine for the pain, pour it. If he stays longer than this money covers, do not throw him out." "And who pays the difference?" the innkeeper asked, skepticism raising his eyebrow. "You will be gone. Travelers vanish like smoke." "I will return," Jorah promised. "I have business in Jericho, but I will pass this way again on my return to the high country. Keep a tally. Mark every loaf of bread, every cup of water, every hour of service. Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." The innkeeper stared at him for a long moment. He was a man who dealt in lies and haggling, but he recognized the weight of truth when he heard it. This Samaritan was not making a casual offer. He was making a covenant. He was underwriting the life of the Jew with his own credit, his own name. "You are a strange man," the innkeeper said finally, sweeping the coins into his pocket. "But your silver is good. I will watch him." "Do not just watch him," Jorah said, turning to leave. "Care for him." Jorah walked out into the bright, harsh sunlight of the courtyard. He saddled his donkey, checking the straps with the same precision he had used the day before. But as he mounted and turned the animal toward the gate, he felt lighter. He had left his money behind, but he had taken his honor with him. The road to Jericho stretched out ahead, waiting for him. But the road behind was no longer a place of guilt. He had stopped. He had acted. And now he could move forward. Elian awoke to the smell of wood smoke and old straw. It was not the crisp, clean air of his home in the highlands, nor was it the sterile silence of the grave. It was the scent of the living. He tried to move, but his body felt as though it had been reconstructed from lead. A sharp, hot pain radiated from his ribs, anchoring him to the floor. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the slats of the window. Memory returned to him in jagged shards, the club striking his shoulder, the dust filling his mouth, the retreating footsteps of his own countrymen. He remembered the despair of the ditch, and then he remembered nothing but a strange, floating darkness. "You are awake." The voice was deep and gruff. Elian turned his head slowly. A large man stood in the doorway, wiping his hands on a stained apron. The innkeeper stepped into the room, carrying a clay bowl that steamed with the scent of broth. "Where?" Elian's voice was a rusted hinge, scraping against his throat. "Where am I?" "You are in the gorge," the innkeeper said, kneeling down to place the bowl near Elian's head. "You are safe, though by all rights you should be food for the jackals." Elian tried to sit up, but his strength failed him. He collapsed back onto the pillow, breathing hard. He looked at his arms. They were clean. The blood had been washed away. He felt the tight, reassuring pressure of linen bandages wrapped around his chest and head. "Who?" Elian asked. "Who brought me?" A flicker of expectation lit up his mind. It must have been a friend, or perhaps a patrol of soldiers from Jerusalem, maybe even a repentant priest who had turned back. The innkeeper sat back on his heels, studying Elian with an unreadable expression. "A traveler brought you. He arrived last night, carrying you on his own beast, while he walked in the dirt. He sat where I am sitting now, cooling your fever until the sun came up." "I must thank him," Elian whispered. "Is he a brother, a son of Judah?" The innkeeper let out a short, dry laugh. It was not mocking, but it carried the weight of a heavy irony. No, he was not a son of Judah. He wore the tunic of the north. He spoke with the accent of the mountains. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Elian stared at the innkeeper, his mind rejecting the implication. "You mean—" "He was a Samaritan," the innkeeper said plainly. The word hung in the air like smoke. Elian felt a physical recoil, a nausea that had nothing to do with his injuries. A Samaritan. The enemy. The half-breed. The heretic. For generations, his people and the Samaritans had shared nothing but animosity. They did not eat together. They did not speak. They certainly did not save one another. "You are lying," Elian breathed, closing his eyes. "A Samaritan would have killed me to finish the job." "Open your eyes, Jew," the innkeeper's voice hardened. He reached out and tapped the bandages on Elian's shoulder. "Look at the oil on your skin. Smell the wine that cleaned your cuts. Do you think the bandits left you with medicine? That Samaritan tore his own clothes to bind you. He walked miles in the dark, risking his own neck, to bring you to my door." Elian looked down. He saw the quality of the linen. He smelled the faint, lingering scent of olive oil. The evidence was on his own body. The hands that had touched him, the hands that had pulled him from death, belonged to a man he had been taught to despise. "Why?" Elian asked, the question fragile and confused. "I do not know," the innkeeper admitted, standing up. Perhaps he saw something in the ditch that the others missed. Perhaps he simply decided that a life was worth more than a grudge. The innkeeper reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of parchment. Though he did not hand it over, he left this morning. But before he went, he paid for this room. He paid for your food. He left silver on my table enough to keep you here until you can walk again." Elian felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He had been stripped naked by thieves, but this news stripped him of his pride. He was indebted to an enemy. The priest had walked by. The Levite had run away. The men of his own tribe, the men who shared his blood and his God, had abandoned him. And the one who stopped, the one who played the hero, was the one Elian would have never invited to his table. "He saved me," Elian whispered, the reality settling over him like a heavy cloak. "He did more than save you," the innkeeper said, turning to the door. "He served you. Now, eat the broth. You cannot hate on an empty stomach." The days that followed were a blur of slow, painful restoration. The inn was not a hospital. It was a hub of noise and commerce. Yet for Elian, it became a sanctuary. The room with the stone walls became his entire world. He learned to rely on the innkeeper. This was a difficult lesson for a man like Elian, who was accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. He had to be helped to sit up. He had to be fed like a child when his hands shook too much to hold the spoon. He had to allow the innkeeper to change the dressings on his wounds, exposing his weakness and his broken flesh to another man's eyes. But the innkeeper was not alone in this work. The inn was a community, a transient village of travelers, servants, and locals. On the second day, a woman who worked in the kitchens brought him warm water to wash his face. She did not speak his language well, but her touch was gentle. On the third day, a young stable boy peeked into the room, eyes wide with curiosity. He brought a handful of fresh figs, placing them shyly on the edge of the pallet before running away. Elian began to realize that the Samaritan's money had purchased more than just a room. It had purchased a place in this community. The silver coins had created a circle of care around him. "You are healing well," the innkeeper said one evening, inspecting the wound on Elian's head. "The swelling is gone." Elian sat against the wall, his strength returning slowly. "You have been kind," he said, "more than I expected." "I am a businessman," the innkeeper grunted, though his eyes were not unkind. "I was paid to be kind." The Samaritan left clear instructions. "What instructions?" Elian asked. He had been afraid to ask about the details of the arrangement, afraid of how deep his debt truly went. The innkeeper sat on the stool, wiping his hands on a rag. "He told me to watch over you. He gave me 2 silver denarii, but he said something else. He said, 'Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back.'" Elian went still. "He is coming back?" "He promised." The innkeeper nodded. "And a man who pays in advance is a man who keeps his word." Elian stared at the flickering lamp. The implication of the promise staggered him. Whatever more you spend, it was a blank check. The Samaritan had not placed a limit on his compassion. He had not said, "Care for him for 3 days and then put him out." He had not said, "Spend 2 coins and no more." He had accepted full liability for Elian's recovery, no matter the cost, no matter the time. "He does not even know me," Elian murmured. "He does not know if I am a good man or a thief. He does not know if I will ever pay him back." "I do not think he cares," the innkeeper observed. "He saw a need, and he covered it. That is a rare thing on this road. Most men look at a wounded stranger and see a problem to be solved by someone else. He saw a debt he chose to pay." Elian looked at his hands, hands that were healing, hands that would one day work again. His perspective was shifting, the foundations of his world cracking and reforming. He had spent his life believing that holiness was about separation, staying away from the unclean, the Gentile, the sinner. But the priest and the Levite had practiced separation, and it had nearly killed him. The Samaritan had practiced connection. He had crossed the line. He had touched the blood. And in that contact, there was life. "I was wrong," Elian said into the quiet of the room. "About what?" "About who my neighbor is," Elian replied. "I thought my neighbor was the man who lived next door, the man who prayed in my synagogue. I thought the circle was closed." The innkeeper stood up, taking the empty bowl. "The road teaches hard lessons, my friend. It strips us of our titles. Out there in the dark, there are no Jews or Samaritans. There are only those who die and those who help." Elian nodded slowly. The physical wounds were closing, but the internal surgery was just beginning. He realized that the interruption on the Jericho road had not been a tragedy. It had been a salvation. If he had not fallen, he would have never known this grace. He would have lived and died in his arrogance. "When he returns," Elian said, his voice firming with a new resolve, "I will be here. I must meet him. I must look him in the eye, not as an enemy, but as a brother." "Rest now," the innkeeper said, blowing out the lamp. "You have time. Healing is slow work, but you are not doing it alone." In the darkness, Elian did not feel the crushing weight of isolation he had felt in the ditch. He felt covered. He felt carried. He was safe in the inn, held by the promise of a stranger who would return. The waiting was the hardest part of the recovery. For 2 weeks, Elian had lived within the stone walls of the inn, his body knitting itself back together under the watchful eye of the innkeeper. He could walk now, though with a limp that would likely stay with him for the rest of his days. He could breathe without the sharp stab of pain in his ribs. But the deeper ache, the debt of honor he owed to a stranger, remained an open wound. Every day, Elian sat in the courtyard, watching the gate. He watched the caravans pass, the soldiers march, and the merchants haggle. He looked for the donkey. He looked for the tunic of the north. He looked for Jorah. The doubt would often creep in during the long afternoons. Why would he come back? Elian thought. He has done enough. He saved me. He paid for me. Why would he return to check on a man who belongs to a people that despise him? Surely he has forgotten. But the innkeeper remained certain. He gave his word, the big man would say, scrubbing the tables. And he left his name. On the 14th day, just as the sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon, the gates groaned open. Elian stood up, his hand gripping his staff for support. A lone rider entered the courtyard. The donkey looked tired, its coat dusty from the road. The man riding it was slumped with fatigue. his face obscured by a headscarf against the wind. But Elian knew the posture. He knew the hands that held the reins. It was Jorah. The courtyard seemed to go quiet. The other travelers, sensing the tension, stopped their conversations. They knew the story of the Jew in the sick room and the Samaritan who had paid his way. They wanted to see the end of the play. Jorah slid off the donkey. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a man who had been working hard, smelling of sweat and the road. He patted the animal's neck, then turned and scanned the courtyard. His eyes found Elian. For a long moment, neither man moved. The distance between them was only 10 paces, but it spanned centuries of history, hatred, and separation. Elian felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do you say to the enemy who became your savior?" Jorah broke the silence. He walked forward, his gait steady. He stopped in front of Elian and looked him up and down, assessing the healing. "You are standing," Jorah said quietly. "Because of you," Elian replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I am standing because you stopped." Jorah nodded, a simple, unpretentious gesture. "I am glad the innkeeper did his work well." The innkeeper stepped out from the shadows, carrying a scroll of parchment. He walked up to the two men, the ledger of debts in his hand. "He ate well," the innkeeper said, looking at Jorah. "We changed the bandages 3 times a day. We used the good oil, as you commanded. And he drank the wine from the cellar, not the vinegar we served the soldiers." Jorah extended his hand. "Show me the tally." The innkeeper unrolled the parchment. It was a long list. Lodging for 14 nights, food, service, supplies. The sum was significant more than most men earned in a month of labor. Elian flinched when he saw the length of the list. He reached for his own belt, instinctively wanting to pay, but he remembered he had nothing. The robbers had taken it all. He was destitute, dependent entirely on this transaction. Jorah did not argue. He did not haggle. He did not complain about the price of the wine or the cost of the bread. He reached into his tunic and pulled out his money pouch. He counted out the silver coins, placing them one by one into the innkeeper's large palm. "Is the debt settled?" Jorah asked. "It is settled," the innkeeper said, closing his hand over the money. "And you have overpaid. There is enough here for provisions for his journey home." Jorah turned back to Elian. "Then you are free to go." Elian stepped forward. He wanted to fall to his knees, but he knew that would embarrass the Samaritan. Instead, he reached out and took Jorah's hand. It was a violation of every custom he had been raised to uphold. A Jew did not touch a Samaritan, but Elian held the hand tight, feeling the calluses, feeling the warmth of the life that had saved his own. "Why?" Elian asked, the question burning in his throat. The priest passed by. The Levite ran. "Why did you stop? Why did you pay? Why did you come back?" Jorah looked at Elian, his eyes tired but kind. He did not quote scripture. He did not offer a theological defense. He simply shrugged, as if the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because you were in the ditch," Jorah said. "And I was on the road, that is all." It was the simplicity of the answer that broke Elian. It wasn't about nationality or religion. It was about proximity and pain. Jorah had seen a human being in need, and that need had superseded everything else. "I can never repay you," Elian whispered. "You do not need to repay me," Jorah said, withdrawing his hand. "Just go home, live your life, and when you see someone in the ditch, do not walk by." The departure the next morning was quiet. The air was cool, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Jorah had left at first light, heading north toward the mountains of Samaria. He had vanished as quietly as he had arrived, refusing any fanfare, leaving Elian with a bag of bread and a donkey arranged by the innkeeper. Elian stood at the gate of the inn, looking at the road that led back up to Jerusalem. It was the same road he had traveled weeks ago, but it looked different now. It was no longer just a trade route or a path of danger. It was holy ground. He mounted the donkey, wincing slightly as his healing ribs protested the movement. He turned the animal's head toward the ascent. The journey home was slow. As he rode, Elian passed the spot where he had fallen. The blood was gone, washed away by the wind and the rain. The rocks were silent, but Elian stopped. He stared at the ditch where he had lain naked and dying. He tried to imagine the priest walking by. He tried to imagine the Levite scurrying away. He felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sadness. They had preserved their rituals, but they had lost their humanity. They had kept their hands clean, but their souls had remained small. And then he thought of Jorah. He thought of the oil and the wine. He thought of the 2 silver coins. He thought of the risk. Elian realized that he was returning to Jerusalem a different man. He could no longer sit in the synagogue and nod when the elders spoke of the unclean Samaritans. He could no longer participate in the quiet, polite prejudice of his people. He had been touched by the enemy, and that touch had healed him. When he finally reached the gates of the city, the sun was high. He rode through the streets, the familiar sounds of the market washing over him. He saw men who looked like the priestmen of status, walking with their heads high, avoiding the beggars. He saw men who looked like the Levite, busy, important, rushing to their duties. And he saw the invisible ones. For the first time in his life, Elian truly saw them. He saw the cripple by the pool, ignored by the crowd. He saw the widow selling grain, her eyes hollow with fatigue. He saw the foreigner, looking lost and afraid in the great city. Before the road to Jericho, they had been background noise. Now, they were people. They were him. He arrived at his own home. His wife wept when she saw him, for they had feared him dead. His children clung to his tunic. His friends gathered around, eager to hear the story of his survival. "Tell us," one of them said, pouring wine. "Tell us how you fought them off. Tell us how God sent an angel to save you." Elian looked at the faces around his table, faces of his own tribe, his own circle. He knew that what he was about to say would shock them. It might even cost him his reputation. It would be easier to lie, to say a merchant from Galilee had helped him, or a soldier from the garrison. But he could not lie. The truth was the only payment he could offer to the man who had ridden away into the north. "It was not an angel," Elian said, his voice steady and clear in the hushed room, "and it was not a priest. I was naked and half dead. Everyone passed me by." He paused, looking at each of them. "The one who saved me," Elian said, "was a Samaritan." A gasp went around the room. A cup was set down hard. "You are confused," a friend said nervously. "The trauma, the fever." "I am not confused," Elian said, standing up. "He bound my wounds with his own hands. He put me on his own donkey. He paid for my life with his own silver. He was the neighbor I did not deserve. And he showed me what it truly means to love God." Silence filled the room. It was an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Elian knew that things would be different now. He would be the man who defended Samaritans. He would be the man who questioned the lines they had drawn in the sand. But as he looked out the window toward the darkening sky, toward the road that wound down to Jericho, Elian smiled. He was alive. He was whole. And he knew that the next time he walked that road, or any road, he would not walk with his eyes fixed on the horizon. He would walk with his eyes on the ditch, looking for the next interruption, waiting for the chance to be the neighbor he had finally met. The story of the Samaritan was over, but the work of the Samaritan was just beginning, and it began with him.